The piercing heat of the afternoon pressed down on Reball Airfield. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai sat in the operations tent, his single eye, the other had been taken by American gunfire 12 months earlier, fixed on the document before him. He began to read, and then he laughed, a sound that cut through the humid air like a blade. "The Americans have built something new," the report said. "A fighter aircraft. But not like anything we've seen before. They're calling it the Hellcat." Sakai shook his head, nearly amused. "Heavy as a bomber," the intelligence said, "wide as a transport plane." The whole thing seemed absurd to him. Outside the tent, through gaps in the canvas, he could see them lined up in perfect rows. His fighters. The Zeros. Sleek machines, nimble and quick, their fuselages gleaming in the tropical sunlight. For 2 years running, nothing in the sky had proven a match for them. The British Hurricanes, the American P-40s, the Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, all had fallen before them. Now the Americans were claiming they'd built something revolutionary. Sakai doubted it very much. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the Japanese pilots gathered for their morning briefing understood, was that 30 days would change everything. The F-6F Hellcat would come to represent the end of an era. When the smoke finally cleared, it would have shot down 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 of its own. The ratio was staggering, 19-1. It would reshape carrier warfare entirely, crushing the Japanese naval air arm and proving that the Zero's dominance had rested on foundations that were fundamentally flawed. The mathematics of air superiority were about to be rewritten by a machine that looked all wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate every principle the Japanese had mastered. But in these final days before the reckoning, the pilots here could still afford to laugh. Within 6 months, many of them would be gone, writing final letters home, understanding with brutal clarity that running into Hellcats meant almost certain death. The confidence of the Japanese Navy in September 1943 appeared to be born from arrogance, but it ran deeper than that. It was rooted in mathematics, in numbers that had been stacked in their favor for nearly 2 years. Since the morning of December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had achieved victory ratios that seemed almost impossible to believe. At Pearl Harbor, they had lost just 29 aircraft. They had destroyed 347 American ones. In the Philippines, the numbers were 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, a mere 2 Japanese aircraft lost while 30 American ones fell. The British Far East Fleet's air arm had been obliterated entirely. The Dutch East Indies Air Force eliminated in days. And at the heart of this winning streak flew a single aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. When American engineers finally got their hands on a captured Zero in 1942 and ran their tests, they couldn't quite believe what the performance data showed them. Here was a fighter that could fly as far as a bomber. It could turn like a biplane. It carried enough firepower to destroy anything it encountered in the air. It seemed impossible. It shouldn't have been able to exist. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa had recorded his thoughts about the aircraft in his diary. He would eventually become known as Japan's greatest ace, with 87 confirmed victories. Flying the Zero, he wrote, was like wearing wings. The machine didn't respond to control inputs. It seemed to respond to thought itself. American planes, he observed, flew like trucks. Powerful, certainly, but clumsy, heavy. They built fighters the way they built automobiles, overbuilt, overweight, wasteful. The Zero's miraculous abilities came from an approach to design that broke all the conventional rules. The fuselage was constructed from a classified aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, a material that created a structure 30% lighter than anything the Americans were building. The pilot sat unarmored. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks adding dead weight. Even the radio was sometimes removed if it saved 30 pounds. Every single ounce was sacrificed in the pursuit of performance. Nothing was wasted. When the first reports of the F-6F Hellcat began to filter through to Japanese intelligence, they came by way of neutral Swedish sources early in 1943. The specifications seemed like propaganda to most officers. Deliberate misinformation, perhaps. The numbers simply didn't make sense. Loaded, This new fighter weighed 12,186 pounds. The Zero weighed 5,800. Its wing area was 334 square feet, and it had a draggy radial engine hanging out in front. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition. There was armor plate everywhere, protecting the pilot, protecting the oil system. Bulletproof glass in the canopy, self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons. The thing sounded like a truck. Captain Minoru Genda studied the specifications at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Genda was the tactical mind who had designed the Pearl Harbor operation. His assessment, which would be preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, was dismissive and confident. The Americans, he concluded, had learned nothing. This Hellcat represented nothing more than the continuation of their failed design philosophy. They were trying to overcome pilot skill through sheer mass and machinery. A Zero would fly circles around it. The mathematics supported him. The Zero's wing loading, the relationship between its weight and its wing area, was 22 pounds per square foot. The Hellcat's was 36.5. In a turning fight, the foundation of all Japanese air tactics, the Hellcat would be helpless. The first encounter came on September 30, 1943, near Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted 6 dark shapes climbing up from the southeast. At first, he thought they were B-25 bombers on an unusual course. Then they turned and he saw it, a single engine, a massive fuselage, wings that looked far too small for the body. First encounter with F-6F type fighter, he would write in his after-action report. Initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Fukui knew exactly what to do. He had done it 1,000 times before. He rolled into a diving turn, using the Zero's superior turning ability to position himself on the enemy's tail. He expected the heavy American fighter to dive straight ahead, to try to escape, to give him the moment he needed to get behind it. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't attempt to turn with him. It went straight up. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney double Wasp, producing 2,000 horsepower, drove it vertical at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow, but his airspeed began to bleed away as the Zero fought against gravity and the laws of physics. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a maneuver that seemed impossible for an aircraft of its weight. A hammerhead turn. It stalled out, flipped, and came directly down onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire at 400 meters. 6 machine guns, Fukui reported. Not the 4 we had expected. The volume of fire was like nothing we had encountered before. My aircraft took 17 hits in the first 3 seconds. Only by dropping into a spin did I manage to escape. Fukui nursed his crippled Zero back to Marcus Island, his fuselage riddled with holes. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao Sato, never returned. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they had been protecting. First blood belonged to the Hellcat. On October 5, 1943, Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 250th Air Group to intercept what appeared to be yet another American hit-and-run attack. The Americans had been launching these raids for months, always fleeing before Japanese fighters could fully engage. This time, Shiga was certain, would be different. "We climbed to 20,000 feet," he wrote in his diary. "Below us, 12 F-6F fighters in 3 tactical divisions. We held every advantage, altitude, position, the element of surprise. Victory seemed certain. What happened next shattered everything the Japanese believed about air combat. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats, the American fighters did something unexpected. They didn't scatter. They didn't attempt to turn and fight. They maintained their formation and accelerated in a gentle dive that kept their energy high, their speed constant. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for lucky hits, the Hellcats simply absorbed the punishment. They flew through the bullets as though they were nothing. The Hellcat's armor was extraordinary. 212 pounds of steel plate shielded the pilot. Another 110 pounds protected the oil system. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb dozens of hits without catching fire. The Zeros, by contrast, had no armor at all. As the Zeros exhausted their ammunition in their diving attacks, the Hellcats began their counterattack. They didn't turn to dogfight. That wasn't their tactic. Instead, they used what the Japanese had always seen as a weakness, their weight, as a weapon. Climbing at full power, the Hellcats reached altitudes where the Zero's engine began to struggle for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still produced 1,650 horsepower. The Zero was down to 900. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Scheiger wrote. Their weight gave them speeds we couldn't match. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react. We were helpless. 8 Zeros fell that day. No Hellcats were lost. On November 11, 1943, at Rabaul, the pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered to hear a briefing. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu stood before them. He had 32 victories to his name and was one of the few pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats. He looked at the assembled pilots and began to speak. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight anymore. They fight like executioners, not like warriors." Tanamizu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly and fatally beginning to understand. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never need to. The Americans had developed something they called energy fighting, a combat doctrine based on maintaining speed and altitude, converting potential energy into kinetic energy through slashing attacks. A Zero pilot would have no opportunity to use superior maneuverability against it. "They work in pairs," Tanamizu continued. "One flies high, one flies low. While you engage one, the other is already diving on you. They have radios, which we once laughed at for their weight. That radio lets them coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a machine." In December 1943, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now served as Air Operations Officer for the combined fleet. He was inspecting the damaged Zeros returning from encounters with Hellcats, and the evidence was clear. The technology gap was widening, and it was significant. The firepower disparity was stark. The Hellcat carried 6 Browning M2 machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute. That was 4,500 rounds per minute total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The Zero carried 2 7.7mm machine guns that fired projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second. Each delivered 750 foot-pounds of energy. Strikes from Hellcat guns would tear aircraft apart. Strikes from Zero guns often just punched holes. Even more disturbing were the reports of American radar-guided fighter direction. While Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight to find their enemies in the vast Pacific sky, Hellcat pilots were guided to their targets by radar controllers aboard American ships. These controllers could see Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away, invisible and unreachable. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described his first radar-directed interception. "We were climbing through clouds when they appeared. No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were. They knew our altitude. They knew our course. We were blind men," he wrote, "fighting those who could see in the dark." The crisis that was developing for Japan went beyond aircraft and tactics. It was a crisis of pilots. The pre-war training program of the Imperial Navy had been the most demanding in the world. Pilots spent 3 years in training before entering combat, accumulating 700 flight hours. Army pilots received 500 hours minimum. They were artists of aerial warfare, trained in aerobatics, gunnery, and the spiritual philosophy of combat flying. By early 1944, everything had changed. Japanese naval pilots were entering combat with 300 hours of flight time. Army pilots with only 200. Fuel shortages meant most training was conducted in gliders, when it happened at all. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot. Formation flying, instrument flight, radio procedures, all abandoned to push pilots to the front faster. Meanwhile, American pilots were arriving in the Pacific with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours flying the Hellcat specifically. They had fired thousands of practice rounds. They had practiced carrier landings until it was automatic muscle memory. They had learned energy tactics in safety over Texas airfields before anyone shot at them. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto was a training officer at Kasumi-Gara Naval Air Station. In his final report, written with something like despair, he tried to explain the impossible situation. "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. "We have no ammunition for practice." He had never flown at night. "We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. In October 1944, from the 12th to the 16th, came the Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commanding the 2nd Air Fleet, committed everything he had to stop the American carrier raids. Over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots remaining from the homeland training squadrons. The Japanese announced magnificent victory. 26 carriers and battleships sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed. The reality was discovered only after the pilots returned and gun camera footage was developed. American losses were 89 aircraft. Japanese losses were 329 aircraft. Nearly every experienced pilot was gone. The last generation of Japanese air combat expertise had been incinerated in 3 days. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu was one of the few surviving veterans. He described what he had witnessed in his memoirs, his voice marked by the weight of memory. "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we descended through the clouds, they materialized below us. The enemy had carved up the entire sky into sections, each territory assigned to a different unit. This wasn't warfare anymore. This was pure, methodical destruction on an industrial scale." June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. What unfolded that day became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy had committed everything: their rebuilt carrier fleet, their remaining aircraft, their most experienced pilots, to Operation AGO. This was supposed to be the decisive moment that would finally crush American carrier power once and for all. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, their finest pilots remaining. Facing them stood Task Force 58, bristling with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft. 450 of those were F-6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his assault in 4 successive waves, convinced that superior Japanese pilot experience and the Zero's superior range would turn the tide. The first wave of 69 planes took off at 8:30 in the morning. American radar picked them up at 150 miles out. Hellcats were immediately directed to intercept, positioned with every advantage, altitude stacked from 20 to 30,000 feet, the sun behind them, approaching from directions the Japanese couldn't defend. When Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, first spotted them through his windscreen, his stomach must have dropped. At least 60 Hellcats hung there like an impenetrable wall of steel. His own formation was down at 18,000 feet. Every tactical advantage belonged to the Americans. The battle lasted just 12 minutes. Of those 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 never made it home. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15, personally sent 7 planes spiraling down to the ocean. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, claimed 6 more kills that single day. "The Zeros tried to outturn us," McCampbell would later explain. "We simply refused to play their game. We'd dive down from above, squeeze the trigger, watch a plane burn, then climb back up for altitude. The Japanese pilots would try to follow, their engines screaming in protest, their aircraft losing speed. Stalled out and vulnerable, another Hellcat would be waiting." By sunset, the Japanese Navy had lost 346 carrier-based aircraft, plus another 50 from land bases. American losses totaled 30 planes from all causes. That evening, American pilots in their ready rooms came up with a name for what they'd just witnessed: a turkey shoot. The Japanese aircraft had been defenseless, like birds flushed from tall grass toward waiting hunters. Weeks later, on October 24, 1944, the stage shifted to the waters near Leyte Gulf. McCampbell would write his name into aviation history once more. Leading 7 Hellcats from the Essex, he spotted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft bearing down on the American fleet. What happened over the next 90 minutes became legendary in naval aviation circles. McCampbell personally destroyed 9 enemy planes, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. His wingman Roy Rushing added 6 more to the score. 7 American fighters had scattered 60 Japanese aircraft and eliminated 15 of them. Not a single Hellcat was lost. By the 9th kill, I had used every round of ammunition, McCampbell later recorded in his flight log. The Hellcat never took a single hit, despite being outnumbered 8-1. This single engagement proved something everyone had begun to suspect. American air superiority was now absolute and overwhelming. Those 2 performances, 7 kills in June, 9 kills in October, would earn McCampbell the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But more than personal glory, they symbolized something far larger. The transformation had been complete. The reversal of power was total, what Japanese military psychologists would later study and eventually term Hellcat psychosis began manifesting among surviving pilots. The confidence that had once defined Japanese aviation had evaporated. In his official report, Admiral Ozawa attempted to explain what had gone wrong. The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction had achieved something we believed was impossible, he wrote. They had industrialized air combat. Each Hellcat was no longer an individual fighter. It was a single component in an enormous machine. Our pilots, regardless of talent and training, were not fighting planes. They were fighting a system. As pilot losses mounted catastrophically, Japan's desperate attempts to rebuild its pilot corps became increasingly frantic. By early 1945, new Navy pilots received barely 40 to 50 hours of training before being sent into combat. Army pilots got 60 to 70 hours. Kamikaze pilots, the ultimate admission of defeat, got around 40 to 50 hours, approximately 1 week. That was all. A week of instruction before sending them to die. When Operation Iceberg began in April 1945, the assault on Okinawa, Japan unleashed 1,900 kamikaze sorties against American ships. The Hellcat became more than just a fighter. It transformed into a shield against the desperation of suicide attacks. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, commanding his flying circus squadron of Hellcats, personally destroyed 23 enemy aircraft during the campaign. His tactical innovations, using coordinated 4-plane divisions executing synchronized attacks, made traditional Japanese tactics obsolete and suicidal. We invented something we called the mowing machine, Valencia explained after the war. 4 Hellcats flying in a line, spaced 100 yards apart, would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed. Every pilot covered his assigned sector. One pass through their formation, climb back to altitude, then do it again. Simple, efficient, devastatingly effective. The numbers from Okinawa told a stark story. Hellcats flew 38,000 combat sorties, achieving 2,351 confirmed victories against 249 losses. That was a kill ratio of 9.5-1. More important than the raw statistics, these aircraft prevented roughly 80% of kamikaze planes from ever reaching their targets. By 1945, the technological chasm between American and Japanese fighters had become impossible to bridge. The F-6F-5 Hellcat incorporated refinements that made it even more formidable. Water injection systems boosted engine output to 2,200 horsepower. Zero-length rocket launchers hung from the wings. Enhanced armor protected the pilot and critical systems. The K-14 computing gun sight calculated deflection automatically, removing the guesswork from gunnery. In June 1944, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace credited with 28 official victories, encountered Hellcats for the first time. His first engagement nearly killed him. Even executing every aerobatic maneuver he had perfected over 200 previous combat missions, loops and rolls and splitting turns, the Hellcat matched him effortlessly, almost casually. "I survived only by fortune," Sakai wrote in his autobiography. The American pilot forgot to release his external drop tank before entering the fight. That single lapse, that one moment of forgetfulness, saved my life. The final accounting revealed the Hellcat's true dominance. Over the entire war, this single aircraft destroyed 5,220 aircraft in aerial combat, while losing only 270 to enemy fighters. That was a kill ratio of 19.3 to 1. Hellcats produced 305 Navy aces. Pilots flying Hellcats accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories. For Japan, the human cost reached catastrophic levels. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had begun the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained when Japan surrendered in August 1945. The transition from elite naval aviation force to kamikaze operations represented Japan's final admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete in conventional air combat, Japan transformed its remaining pilots into human-guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who created the kamikaze program, justified the strategy with brutal mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier the traditional way, the probability of success approaches zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. But if the Zero becomes a bomb, if the pilot accepts death as inevitable, then the probability of hitting a target rises to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death carries meaning. On October 25, 1944, Japan's greatest ace, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. During that mission, he claimed 2 more kills, 2 F-6F Hellcats. The next morning, October 26th, Nishizawa died as a passenger aboard a transport plane shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's ace of aces, stripped of his fighter, fell victim to the very aircraft he had briefly defeated. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled across the radio on August 15, 1945, Captain Minoru Genda stood at Atatsugi airfield listening to his nation's surrender. Around him sat what remained of Japanese naval aviation. Teenage pilots with barely 40 hours of flying experience patched together aircraft assembled from spare parts, fuel tanks running dry. That same day, flying from USS Belleau Wood, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31 shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Japanese pilot apparently didn't know the war had ended. Moore's 6 guns fell silent, and the Pacific Air War ended. When American forces landed at Atatsugi Airfield in September 1945, the first aircraft to touch down were 12 F-6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew lined the runway to observe their tormentor in person. Lieutenant Robert Vrasu, an ace with 19 victories, decided to give them a demonstration. His casual aerobatics, loops and rolls and vertical climbs, maneuvers that would have shredded a Zero's wings, left the Japanese pilots stunned into silence. "You need to understand something," Vrasu told them through an interpreter. "This isn't even maximum performance. In combat with water injection engaged, this aircraft is 20% more powerful. The airframe is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never once managed to break one." Japanese engineers who studied captured Hellcats after the war discovered the full scope of American industrial superiority. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,804 precisely machined parts, every single one perfectly interchangeable with any other R2800 engine produced. The Nakajima engine that powered the Zero required hand-fitting of components. No 2 engines were identical, no 2 performed exactly the same. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant designer of the Zero, examined captured Hellcats extensively. His conclusion cut to the heart of why Japan had lost. "We designed an aircraft for 1941, he concluded. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we perfected the sword, they constructed the industrial age. The production itself became a weapon." Grumman's factory at Bethpage, New York operated round the clock, every single day of the week. At peak efficiency, a brand new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes. The company produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. The Japanese couldn't fathom such output. In 1944 alone, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of all types combined. America produced 35,000 fighters that year. Just that year. The production system incorporated innovations that baffled Japanese observers. Color-coded instructions allowing workers to assemble complex components, continuous shift operations, maintaining quality despite breakneck speed, consistency across every single aircraft. The Hellcat revolutionized naval warfare itself. Pre-war doctrine held that carriers were vulnerable platforms requiring first-strike capability to survive. The Hellcat inverted this assumption. Carriers transformed into fortresses that could absorb and repel any assault. They could now withstand whatever the enemy threw at them. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, understood this transformation profoundly. "With the Hellcat protecting us, we don't need to search them out," he said. "Let them come to us. The F-6F will destroy them whenever we choose." This confidence enabled unprecedented offensive operations. American carriers could position themselves off enemy coastlines for weeks, their Hellcat umbrella rendering them essentially invulnerable to air attack. Beyond pure technology, the Hellcat represented a cultural and philosophical approach that undermined Japanese military doctrine at its foundation. Samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, spiritual fortitude, and acceptance of death. The Hellcat embodied systematic efficiency, material superiority, and the preservation of pilot lives. This philosophical chasm meant Japanese pilots couldn't adapt to Hellcat tactics even when they comprehended them intellectually. The very concept of breaking off combat when disadvantaged, fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was literally unthinkable to pilots raised in Bushido tradition. In 1962, the United States Navy held a symposium examining Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans sat together to reflect on the conflict. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories, spoke plainly. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable. Commander Saburo Sakai responded with equal honesty. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until far too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The mathematics of the Hellcat's dominance tell a profound story. The kill ratio of 19-1 overall, 13-1 specifically against Zeros. Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. Japan produced roughly 6,000 Zeros between 1943 and 1945. American pilots trained on Hellcats numbered over 5,000. Japanese pilots remaining by August 1945 who could still fly combat missions numbered fewer than 100. Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, offered perhaps the most honest assessment of all. "We laughed at the Hellcat because we failed to recognize that it represented not merely an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to warfare. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had simply ceased to exist." Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000. In one of his final interviews, someone asked him about the Hellcat. His answer captured the totality of its dominance. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan understand it was never as great as it believed. "We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were simply men carrying outdated weapons facing the future. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to allow them to live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing only at your enemy's discretion." The F-6F Hellcat entered combat weighing twice what the Zero weighed. It carried armor the Zero lacked, powered by an engine Japan couldn't manufacture, armed with weapons Japan couldn't match, guided by radar systems Japan couldn't even detect, flown by pilots Japan couldn't equal in training, and produced in quantities Japan couldn't possibly comprehend. Japanese pilots had mocked it because they didn't grasp that every additional pound represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could protect its warriors. By the time they grasped this truth, their laughter had transformed into last letters home, their mockery into kamikaze missions, their confidence into complete collapse. The Hellcat hadn't merely defeated the Zero, it had demolished an entire philosophy of warfare. It proved that in modern combat, the nation capable of building the superior system would always destroy the nation that could only produce superior individual warriors. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.